Mark and Michael Sullivan, identical twins separated at birth, lived vastly different lives. One a respected accountant, the other a career criminal. When Mark vanished without a trace and skeletal remains were found years later in a shallow grave, the evidence pointed to a shocking crime. But as investigators peeled back the layers, the truth revealed a tale so twisted, it turned everything they thought they knew upside down. Mark Sullivan was an unassuming figure in his Denver community. At 45 years old, he lived a quiet life with his wife, Linda, in a modest suburban home. As an accountant, Mark was known for his precision and attention to detail, qualities that extended into his personal life. He followed a strict daily routine, rarely deviating from his well-planned schedule. On weekdays, he left for work at precisely 7:15 a.m., picked up coffee from the same cafe, and returned home by 6 p.m. Neighbors often commented on his predictability, noting that Mark's life seemed like it ran on rails. It was a Friday morning in mid-July when Mark failed to show up at the office. His coworkers were perplexed, but assumed he might be running late. By noon, concern began to grow. Calls to his home went unanswered, and Linda, too, was unable to reach him. By evening, the situation turned alarming. Linda called the police, reporting her husband is missing. Mark's car was found later that night in a supermarket parking lot, about 5 miles from his office. The vehicle was unlocked, with the driver's side door slightly ajar. On the passenger seat sat his cell phone, wallet, and a set of house keys. Nothing appeared out of place, and there were no signs of a struggle. The eerie stillness of the scene unsettled investigators. It was as if Mark had simply stepped out of his car and vanished into thin air. The initial investigation focused on retracing Mark's steps. Surveillance footage from the supermarket parking lot showed his car entering the lot at 8:03 a.m. and parking near the entrance. A shadowy figure, assumed to be Mark, exited the vehicle. However, the camera angle made it impossible to discern his face. What happened next was anyone's guess. He was not seen entering the supermarket, and no further sightings of him were reported that day. Police combed through Mark's personal and professional life for clues. By all accounts, he was a devoted husband, a reliable employee, and an all-around upstanding citizen. Financial records showed no irregularities, and interviews with friends and family revealed no evidence of hidden troubles. Linda described their marriage as happy and stable, dismissing any notion that he might have left voluntarily. Speculation began to swirl as days turned into weeks. Some believed Mark might have been the victim of a random abduction, while others suggested he could have staged his own disappearance. Rumors of a secret life gained traction when an anonymous tip claimed to have seen him boarding a bus bound for Chicago. However, this lead, like many others, proved to be a dead end. Despite exhaustive efforts, no new evidence surfaced. Search teams scoured nearby woods, rivers, and abandoned properties, but not a single trace of Mark was found. The media picked up the story, dubbing it the vanishing accountant. Experts debated the case on talk shows, while amateur sleuths formed online groups to speculate about what might have happened. As hope of finding Mark alive dwindled, Linda found herself trapped in a liminal space between grief and uncertainty. Without a body or definitive answers, she was unable to mourn or move on. The case officially went cold, leaving behind only questions and the haunting image of an empty car in a parking lot. 2 years passed with no significant developments in the search for Mark Sullivan. His disappearance lingered in the minds of those who knew him, but as time wore on, his case faded from public attention. For Linda Sullivan, however, the absence remained a daily torment. The unanswered questions gnawed at her, as did the whispers from neighbors and strangers alike. Some suggested she had something to do with her husband's disappearance. Others speculated he had run off to start a new life. With no closure, Linda lived in a state of perpetual limbo. Then, in the fall of 1998, an unexpected discovery would catapult Mark's case back into the spotlight. 2 hikers traversing a remote trail in the Rocky Mountains stumbled upon what they initially thought were animal bones protruding from the ground. Curiosity led them closer, and their horror grew as they realized they were looking at a human skeleton, partially buried in a shallow grave. Panicked, they called authorities, who arrived swiftly to secure the scene. The location was desolate, far from any well-traveled paths, and the grave had been crudely dug. The remains were incomplete, but a few items found nearby immediately drew attention. A leather briefcase, remarkably well preserved, sat partially hidden beneath a layer of leaves. Inside were several bundles of cash wrapped in rubber bands and a passport bearing the name and photo of Mark Sullivan. The discovery shocked investigators, who had begun to believe Mark might never be found. Dental records quickly confirmed the remains belonged to Mark Sullivan. However, the condition of the skeleton posed significant challenges for forensic experts. Decomposition was advanced and no soft tissue remained, making it nearly impossible to determine the exact cause of death. There were no visible fractures on the bones to suggest blunt force trauma or violence, but the circumstances of the burial and the presence of cash raised immediate suspicions of foul play. The money in the briefcase presented another puzzle. Serial numbers on the bills matched currency stolen during a Denver bank robbery just days before Mark disappeared. This revelation complicated the narrative surrounding his case. Was Mark an unsuspecting victim who had stumbled upon the stolen cash, or was he somehow involved in the heist? Investigators revisited the timeline of Mark's disappearance with renewed vigor, scouring police records and witness statements from the time. Despite their efforts, no direct link between Mark and the robbery could be established. No one had reported seeing him near the bank, and none of the suspects apprehended in connection with the crime had ever mentioned his name. The discovery reignited public fascination with the case, and media outlets once again swarmed Linda's home. She maintained her belief that Mark had been an innocent man, caught in a situation beyond his control. But the discovery of the stolen money made even the staunchest supporters question the narrative. As investigators tried to connect the dots, one thing was clear. The truth behind Mark Sullivan's disappearance and death was far stranger and more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of Mark Sullivan's remains and the stolen cash raised more questions than answers. Investigators were determined to uncover how a mild-mannered accountant with no criminal record could be connected to a high-stakes bank robbery. As they delved deeper, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: surveillance footage from the day of the heist. The footage, grainy but serviceable, showed a man entering the bank just before the robbery. Wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, he moved with calm precision, slipping behind the teller's counter and filling a duffel bag with cash. After only 3 minutes, he exited through a side door, disappearing into the busy street. The man's face was obscured, but his build, height, and mannerisms were strikingly similar to Mark Sullivan's. At first glance, it seemed the mystery was solved. The footage suggested Mark had orchestrated the robbery, fled with the money, and met his untimely end in the mountains. But when forensic analysts reviewed the tape, inconsistencies emerged. A closer analysis of the man's posture and gait revealed subtle differences from Mark's typical movements. Even more striking was the height discrepancy. Mark was recorded as 5'10" in his driver's license, but the man on the tape appeared closer to 6'1". This revelation turned the investigation on its head. If the man in the footage wasn't Mark, then who was he? And how did stolen money end up in Mark's possession? As investigators combed through old files, a shocking piece of Mark's past came to light. A sealed adoption record revealed he had a twin brother, Michael Sullivan, who had been separated from him at birth and placed with another family. Michael's life, unlike Mark's, was marked by instability and crime. A known petty thief and con artist, Michael had spent years moving from city to city, using different aliases to evade capture. He had a history of forgery, burglary, and identity theft, often targeting those closest to him. By the time Mark went missing, Michael hadn't been seen in years. The twin revelation cast the case in a new light. Investigators began to theorize that Michael might have been the man in the footage, leveraging his identical appearance to frame Mark for the robbery. This would explain the stolen cash in the briefcase and why Mark's remains were found buried in a remote location. But it also posed another troubling question. If Michael had orchestrated the crime, how did he end up dead while Mark vanished? Investigators faced a daunting task. They scoured old records and questioned anyone who had known Michael. A few acquaintances described him as cunning and manipulative, willing to do whatever it took to get ahead. Others recalled his fascination with Mark, whom he referred to as the Golden Boy. The emerging picture was one of envy and resentment, a sibling rivalry that might have spiraled into violence. Despite the tantalizing clues, concrete answers remained elusive. The possibility of a deadly confrontation between the brothers loomed large, but without more evidence, the truth remained out of reach. Public interest in the case grew as the idea of a twin doppelganger introduced a twist few had anticipated. The mystery deepened, leaving everyone to wonder how two lives, bound by blood, had become entwined in such a dark and tragic web. In 2001, 5 years after Mark Sullivan's disappearance, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. Investigators had exhausted every lead, and the revelation of his twin brother Michael added more questions than answers. Theories abounded, but nothing could be definitively proven. Then, out of nowhere, a retired truck driver named George Harrington came forward with a story that reignited the investigation. George had been traveling along a desolate stretch of highway in Colorado on the night Mark disappeared. His route took him through a sparsely populated area with few landmarks and even fewer witnesses. George claimed that as he passed a remote turnout, he saw two men standing near a parked car, illuminated by the vehicle's headlights. The pair appeared to be arguing, their gestures animated and aggressive. At the time, George hadn't thought much of it. Arguments between travelers weren't uncommon, and he was focused on completing his delivery. But as he followed the news about the Sullivan case, he realized the man in the argument bore a striking resemblance to Mark. What's more, the other man's description, a near-identical appearance with subtle differences, matched the only photo George had seen of Michael Sullivan. The details George provided were enough to bring investigators back to the scene he described. Using satellite images and old maps, they identified the turnout and conducted a thorough search of the area. Although years had passed, they uncovered a rusted pocket knife with faint traces of blood near the site. Forensic testing revealed that the DNA matched Mark Sullivan's profile. This discovery added another layer to the mystery. It supported the theory of a violent confrontation between the brothers, but didn't explain what happened next. If the argument escalated into a fight, how did Mark end up buried in the mountains with stolen cash? And if Michael had been the aggressor, why was Mark the one who disappeared while Michael was never found alive? George's testimony also raised the possibility of a third party. He recalled seeing a second car parked farther down the turnout, its headlights dimmed, as though someone didn't want to draw attention. It was too dark for George to make out the vehicle's make or model, but it suggested that someone else might have been present during the altercation. The investigation shifted focus to uncovering who else could have been involved. Police interviewed former associates of Michael Sullivan, digging into his criminal past for clues. One name kept appearing, a known fence named Tony Slim Morales, who had been involved in laundering stolen goods. Slim had connections to the Denver bank robbery and was rumored to have worked with Michael on previous schemes. When police tracked down Slim, they found him living in New Mexico under an assumed name. Under pressure, Slim admitted to knowing both brothers, but denied any involvement in the events surrounding Mark's disappearance. However, his account hinted at a plan gone wrong. He suggested that Michael had enlisted Mark to help with the robbery, exploiting their resemblance, but that things got messy afterward. Slim's vague and evasive statements left investigators frustrated. They couldn't determine whether he was withholding crucial details or simply spinning a tale to throw them off track. Despite their best efforts, the trail once again went cold. The possibility of a violent confrontation between Mark and Michael remained the most plausible explanation. But with limited evidence and no new leads, the case settled back into uncertainty. The image of two identical men arguing under the cold glow of headlights lingered in the public imagination, a haunting reminder of how close investigators had come to the truth, only to have it slip away. By 2003, the mystery surrounding Mark Sullivan's disappearance had become a cautionary tale in the world of true crime. The story of an unassuming accountant entwined in a web of robbery, murder, and betrayal fascinated the public but frustrated investigators. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved, leaving Mark's widow, Linda, and countless others with only theories and speculation. Then came the breakthrough no one saw coming. A routine border checkpoint in Tijuana, Mexico, turned into the key to unraveling the entire mystery. Customs agents detained a man attempting to cross into the United States using a forged passport. The man's appearance didn't match the name on the document, but something about his demeanor caught the agent's attention. A quick fingerprint scan revealed his true identity: Mark Sullivan, alive and well. The news shocked everyone. Mark had been presumed dead for 5 years. His skeletal remains buried in the Rocky Mountains. But here he was, very much alive, living under an alias in a small coastal town in Mexico. Authorities extradited him to the United States, where he was immediately taken into custody. What followed was a confession so bizarre it almost defied belief. Mark admitted to faking his death, but the story behind it was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. He and Michael had reconnected a few months before the bank robbery. Michael, aware of Mark's clean record and financial expertise, proposed a scheme. Mark would impersonate Michael during a robbery, take the cash, and the brothers would split the haul. Desperate for excitement and frustrated with his stagnant life, Mark reluctantly agreed. The plan seemed foolproof. Mark donned a disguise and executed the robbery with precision, just as the surveillance footage had shown. But things quickly unraveled. Michael, unsatisfied with his share, demanded a larger cut of the money. The argument escalated, and Mark claimed Michael attacked him during their meeting at the highway turnout. In the heat of the moment, Mark fought back, fatally stabbing Michael with the pocket knife later found by investigators. Panicked, Mark buried Michael's body in the mountains and staged the scene to look like his own death. He planted the stolen cash and his passport near the grave, hoping investigators would conclude he had been killed and robbed. To ensure his plan worked, he abandoned his car and left other personal items in a way that pointed to his disappearance. For years, Mark lived off the stolen money, moving between small towns in Mexico to avoid detection. But the guilt of what he had done and the constant fear of being caught eventually became too much to bear. When authorities caught him at the border, he admitted he was considering returning to the U.S. to face the consequences. Mark was charged with manslaughter and robbery, receiving a lengthy prison sentence. The case, once thought to be a tale of murder and betrayal, turned out to be a shocking story of desperation, greed, and deception. The truth, though unearthed after years of speculation, left more questions than answers. Could Mark have avoided his tragic downfall? Was Michael's manipulation the true catalyst, or had Mark willingly embraced the darker path? The case of Mark Sullivan remains one of the most confounding and unforgettable chapters in modern crime history.